Hi, I'm Rabbi Baruch Halevi, also known as Rabbi B. Welcome to Soul Centered. Soul Centered is a center for loss, for meaning, for healing. We're based in Denver, Colorado, but we work with people around the world virtually, like everybody else now. It's a passion of ours to guide people through loss, meaning, and healing, both offering counseling services, but also experiences like this. This is what I'm calling transforming tragedy. Remember to transform tragedy. And it's a series, a video series that was inspired by executive director of Jewish Family Service in Omaha, Nebraska, Karen Gustafson, and the great work that JFS does around the country, but also especially in Omaha, Nebraska, where I'm from. Karen invited me to do this series to reconnect with my people, my base in Omaha. I'm born and bred in Omaha, Nebraska, very much who I am and what I do. And so this is for the community. JFS serves the greater community, not just Jewish. So this is for the greater community, but it's for anybody. It's for everybody. It's a universal message that we all need in times like these. This is part 4 of a series of videos, and this one's called Spark Seekers. Spark Seekers is the name of my book. Spark Seekers, Mourning with Meaning, Living with Light, about grieving and moving through mourning with purpose and direction. It's an idea, not just a title, I've taken from Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. Everything that's soul-centered, everything that I offer is grounded in Judaism, Kabbalah, mysticism, but borrowing best practices from other traditions and made available to anybody and to everybody, and especially this idea of spark seekers. It's one that resonates with me, and I integrate it in my life daily on a regular basis, and it speaks to the people I guide, and I know it'll speak to you. So spark seekers is this Kabbalistic idea that just affirms what we already know, that darkness is the natural order of things. The universe, right, science will tell us, is born in darkness. Out of that darkness, the Big Bang, right, comes the explosion of life as we know it. Kabbalah talks about the birth of the universe, also the birth of human beings, right, from the embryo growing out of darkness, and the birth of us, each and every one of us at a deeper level. Darkness descends in a myriad of ways, not just physical darkness, not even physical darkness, but emotional and spiritual darkness. And every one of us, collectively or individually, has had or will have the dark night of the soul. I want to talk about dealing with the darkness, taking it head on, and going back to my roots. As much as I love my childhood in Omaha, Nebraska, there are some moments of darkness that we didn't deal with well in my family. One of them in particular is around my grandmother. Those of you watching in Omaha, Nebraska might have known my grandmother, Ruth Babe Perlman. My grandma Babe struggled with darkness, specifically around depression for many years, many decades, and they did the best they could with what they had, the resources at the time. But whatever it wasn't good enough. And my grandmother ended up completing suicide, killing herself when I was 15 years old. In that process, it was what happened was I call tragedy compounded. It was a tragedy that she killed herself, of course. But what happened next was tragedy compounded, unnecessarily compounded tragedy, specifically because we didn't deal with the darkness. We didn't talk about the darkness. I call these the dark Ds: depression, divorce. Almost all my aunts and uncles were divorced. We didn't talk about that. We didn't talk about disease anytime it manifested itself. It was a different era, it was a different time, but nonetheless, silence, right? As Simon and Garfunkel say, like a cancer grows. But all kinds of Ds, depression I already mentioned, but also disasters like the one that's happening in the world around us. And some people turn towards it. We didn't turn towards it. It was off limits. I wasn't allowed to talk about it. And because of that, and 1,000 other factors, but in large part because of that, I watched my father descend into hell, into ultimately following in his mother's footsteps and completing suicide, killing himself about 15 years ago, roughly 20 years after she killed herself. And during that time, and especially after my dad died, I committed to this idea of spark seekers, to taking the darkness and defying the darkness by dispelling it through conversation and attention, addressing it, because we can navigate through the darkness if we put our attention on it and become spark seekers. Kabbalah teaches that in that darkness, there are always sparks of possibility, of purpose, of blessing even, and beauty, if we're willing to go into the darkness and make them yield light. This is called B'Tselem Elohim. We are the image of the Creator. The Creator, right, created through darkness to light. We read in the Bible, in the Torah, Vayer vayiboker. There was evening, there was morning, there was dark, and there was light. It's a constant process of dispelling the darkness through illuminating light. And so we become co-creators in this process. And that's why, from a Jewish perspective, we always begin time at night, because it says evening and morning. And so our holy days begin at night, but also because it allows us to live out the mantra of the mission of our tradition, which is to dispel darkness. So what do we do at the beginning of a Jewish holy day? We always light candles, right? A little light dispels a lot of darkness, said the great Rabbi Zalman Shneur of Liadi. So we dispel the darkness by lighting light, by illuminating the candles as a symbol of how we are supposed to live in this world, how we're supposed to make our stand. And when that darkness has erupted in Jewish history, from a Jewish perspective, we have made our stand. For instance, the Holocaust. Out of the greatest moment of darkness in human history, and certainly as a Jew, a third of the Jewish people were annihilated, the hands of the Nazis, we didn't succumb to the darkness. I've talked about this in previous videos. We utilized that as an opportunity to become spark seekers. And out of that came individuals who would not die in the darkness. A great story about Reb Yassel of Rockover, and he was a survivor, at least up until a point in the Holocaust, where he was holding out in the Warsaw Ghetto, and he watched everybody he loved annihilated, and he had a couple Molotov cocktails left, and he writes this long letter. You should read it. I'll send it to you if you shoot me an email. And in it, he says, I'm going to make my final stand, and I'm going to take out as many Nazis as I can, but not before I write down these words. And he wrote down this last will and testament of what God couldn't take from him, and what the Nazis couldn't take from him, his faith, his desire, his light, he didn't say it, but his ability to be a spark seeker, to not to let the outside world, external circumstances dictate his response. My teacher, Dr. Viktor Frankl, another Holocaust survivor, said, this is the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's way. That's what it means to be a spark seeker, no matter what you're dealing with, no matter how dark it might be, to find sparks and not to give up in that darkness until you make it yield sparks of light. We are finishing right now the holy days on the Jewish calendar of Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Memorial Day and Israeli Independence Day. And they're a beautiful example of consciously creating a calendar around spark seekers. Why? Because the leaders and the rabbis who founded the state of Israel decided to create this model as a blueprint of how to live. So we have the saddest day of the year in Israel. Everybody knows somebody who has died. Everybody goes out into the streets when the air raid sirens sound, and they stand solemn, tears, because you know somebody. You're not disconnected from death there, either through loss during a war or an act of terror against Israel. And it's a painful, tragic day. And yet, as it turns into the next day, which is at night, as I mentioned, it's a whole different type of tears. It's tears not of sorrow, but tears of joy. In that very place where we were having a memorial, now is a place to have a dance around freedom and celebration. Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day, at least usually, not this year, there's nothing like it anywhere, because you go from that darkness into the light. Right? A great teaching I once heard said, if you can't cry on Memorial Day, you can't dance on Independence Day. And there's great dancing on Independence Day because there's great pain and suffering on Memorial Day. And that's the idea. Not to allow the sorrow and the darkness to overwhelm us, to be honest, to face it, not to spend our life doing the void dance, avoidance, a dance around the void, but to feel it, to face it, and to dance through it, to come out the other side with a true freedom, a freedom that was paid in blood and sweat and tears by those who died in the formation of the state of Israel. And we don't allow it to remain in that. We celebrate on the next day. And it's a model for all of us, whether or not you're Israeli, whether or not you resonate with that story. It's a model, it's a blueprint for how we should face our dark times. collectively, societally, we will all face those dark times. We're facing them now with coronavirus, and families and individually, we will all face those dark times and different types of traumas and trials and tragedies. And when those dark times descend upon our lives, and they will, I hope and pray that you remember this idea that you were put here to be B'Tselem Elohim, in the divine image. And that means going into the darkness like Reb Yassol and like great men and women have for thousands of years, and saying, I will not die in the darkness. I will not succumb to the darkness. I will pick myself up. I will move forward, and I will love more completely. I'm going to live more fiercely, not in spite of the darkness, but because of the darkness. That's the mission of all of us. And that's my prayer for you, to go out into the world and to become a spark seeker and to make that darkness yield light. May all of you know only light, but when the darkness comes, may all of you, may all of us become spark seekers. Salam, shalom, peace, and namaste.